is titled Beauty and Classical Music in the Academy. It's not going to be a traditional talk because I'm not exactly your traditional speaker either. No matter what composer was here, my guess is they would not be completely traditional. So here's how this is going to work, just so you know what to expect. I'm going to play you a little music to start things off, just so we can start with the oral experience. There's no PowerPoint with today's lecture. And in fact, I rarely do that because I really want people who listen to me or to my music to be using their ears. Then we'll talk a little bit about the nature of beauty from a philosophical standpoint, or an aesthetic standpoint. And then also a little bit about art, which at least pertains to questions about beauty. And I'll be referring to two thinkers who I think are just marvelous folks who have been looking at this kind of material. One is Roger Scruton, the philosopher. He's written a book called also The Aesthetics of Music, which I think is one of the best works on music by anybody, by musician, by philosopher, whatever, in about the last 25, 30 years at least. And then Dennis Dutton's book, The Art Instinct, talking a little bit from a cultural anthropological viewpoint on what art is. And then from there, with that background, and having played one piece for you yet again, then we'll talk a little bit about the nature of music in the academy, in the university. In other words, we're going from the general to the specific to see where the overlap is, and perhaps if some of these questions from an aesthetic and anthropological standpoint have a deep way of informing our understanding of music in contemporary society, and therefore also as it is particularly manifested in the university. So I'm going to start us off by playing a first movement of a piece, Black Light. Black Light is in two movements. The first movement is a slow adagio, and the second movement is best characterized as a fast scherzo. Now, I'm going to pose a few questions to you, which even some of you may consider terribly simplistic or terribly basic, but as Dr. Balch alluded to, the biggest questions are often the simplest ones when it comes right down to it. And I have to admit, the older I get, the less I think I know about what it is I do or about what music is. Doesn't mean I don't talk about it a lot. Doesn't mean I don't have a lot to say about it. I just know less about exactly how things work. In other words, I find the entire process more and more mysterious the older I get. Analysis is marvelous because it takes things apart. That's what musicians love to do. What we don't and can't quite particularly tell is exactly then why all of those parts do what they do. That's the mystery that is at the core of any great work of art, be it music or visual art or dance, in my humble estimation. So I'm going to play the first movement of Black Light. I'm not going to suggest to you that this is a, quote, great piece. Why will I not say that? I'll tell you that I love the piece. I tell you that I think it's a fabulous piece. But we won't be able to know anything about this for at least 100 years or two. Let's just start with that as a given. We'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about beauty and how we can calculate beauty. We're in the midst of all of this stuff. The best we can do is listen hard, make our own decisions, figure out why we like something or don't like something. We'll talk about that momentarily too. But the first thing is just to listen. So what's the problem just with listening? What's the difficulty for us as listeners that doesn't pertain to looking at a painting by Rothko or Pollock or Leonardo? The answer, I think, is a very simple one, and that is when you look at a painting, it is all there in an instant when you see it. You don't take everything in, admittedly, but there it is in its totality. You can stand in front of it, you can witness it, you can perceive it as long as you wish. Music, of course, takes place in the ether of time. It's problematic. I still don't quite understand how we grasp these things, but there it is. But the brain is able to remember things. It's very important for us, and perhaps have intimations of where we are going, where we might be going. We'll talk about a little bit more about what that means in terms of the style of a piece. But without a doubt, I can tell you the following. I think the following statement is true, and that is to actually hear a piece of music requires the most intense kind of concentration that I think we as humans are capable of participating in. Now, this may sound oxymoronic in our time in as much as you see everybody walking around with an iPod listening to music. When I say listening to music, I mean something quite else. It's quite different than somebody who's taking in music on an iPod. I mean actually focusing with intent on what it is they are hearing. So with that, I'm going to suggest just a few parameters that we listen for the first time around. The first time you listen, that's also axiomatic. It seems to me that you have to listen to a piece of music at least 2 times, preferably 3, before you can even begin to understand and or talk about the piece of music, right? There's just too much going on. Doesn't mean that after the first listen you can't say, wow, there's something there that I want to listen for that second time. Or you might say, oh, do I not want to listen to this piece a second time? That's possible too, right? But sometimes, by the way, that second response, after you listen to it a second time, you say, maybe I didn't quite get it the first time. Now I'm getting the picture a little bit better. I see what's happening. So let me suggest the following to you as we listen the first time. And just go with me on this, right? Let's imagine that we're all best of buddies, don't we? First of all, we're going to close our eyes. Okay? We don't have a live performer here, so you don't have to see gesticulations, you don't have to see facial expressions right now. This is a recording. It's second best. It's not like this face-to-face communication that we are having or that you have in a true performance. We're going to want to talk about that too. I've just made a fairly contentious statement. Is there a difference between live and recorded music in our experience of it? That's a side note. The first time around, we're going to listen to large-scale construction, right? Where are we? What kind of music? What kind of emotive content am I hearing right now? And then the second thing to listen for is what I'm hearing now something new or something different. Again, that sounds fairly simple and basic, but there it is. Is there continuity or is there change? Is something new just occurred? Then if you want to get really more sophisticated, we can talk about register. Where is it in register space? Is it high or low? We can talk about timbre, color. You're going to keep track of that. How fast is that changing? How is that pulling you around? We're going to talk about in this first movement, is there any sort of climax? Western music generally has a direction. It generally has a movement through time that leads us someplace. It is a story. It is a story. And then most fundamentally, something that Scruton mentions from his philosophical standpoint, not just his musical standpoint, he says, look, quite simply, we listen to music from our own personal experience. Our response to it has to somehow come from an internal logic that we bring to it from our own lives. It's not a musicologist talking, it's not a theoretician talking, but it's a deep thinker saying, on a most fundamental, basic level, how do we respond to this stimuli called sound? Okay? This music, this language of some sort that we all know, by the way, has meaning. What does that mean, by the way? What does meaning mean with music? We all know, all the musicians here know that when you play a piece, it has a meaning for us. Is it an extra musical meaning? Or is it simply something that is inherent in the music and the music is the meaning? That sounds a bit tautological, but there it is. But it can be a very deep meaning, by the way, just on a purely musical level. So, we're going to play this first tune. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes so you're not worrying about what anybody else is thinking or moving. Just turn off your cell phones. Turn the ringers off if you haven't already. Let's just focus now. And I really mean focus on the listening, on what you're hearing. Don't think about dinner. Don't think whether I'm boring or not. I hope I'm modulating my voice so you're not asleep, right? We're going to focus on this piece of music. Okay. Okay. I'm going to ask you to just let that float in your mind as I continue on. We're going to play it again in a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about that piece. So Scruton wrote a beautiful little book on beauty. This is a compilation of some of those great ideas with some of my reflections. So according to Plato, beauty is an ultimate value, something we pursue for its own sake, and for the pursuit of which no further reason need be given. Beauty should therefore be compared to truth and goodness, one member of a trio of ultimate values which justify our rational inclinations. But the status of beauty is questionable in a way that the status of truth and goodness are not. Why is that? Well, there's a bit of a paradox. Something is enjoyable, right? You like getting your back scratched. Your own enjoyment is the criteria of sincerity. You really like getting your back scratched. With beauty, matters are otherwise. Here, the judgment focuses on the object judged. So in this case, it's not your back, not the subject who judges. The judgment of taste is a genuine judgment, one that we support with reasons. That's what we do when we're studying musicology and theory. We're giving reasons for why we think something is worth our time to really listen to. The paradox is this: the judgment of beauty makes a claim about its object and can be supported by reasons for its claim. But the reasons do not compel the judgment and can be rejected without contradiction. I've tried to figure out the best example for that. And the best I can come up with is, many people love Wagner's music. Many people love Brahms' music. Brahms happened to love Wagner's music. That's probably immaterial. But the point is, just because the Wagnerites hate Brahms and the Brahmsites hate Wagner does not mean that one or the other wrote bad music. Because we recognize that these are two of the greatest composers who've ever lived. But it just happens that those who love Wagner just don't want to really spend their time listening to Brahms. Okay? We might not say that, the likelihood we wouldn't say that with the same categories of goodness and truth. Judgments, there's an important word in our time, judgments of value tend to be comparative. This is better than this. This is worse than this. This is the best example of this genre. To speak of beauty is to enter into another and exalted realm. Uh-oh, we're using religious language. Problem for our time. Problem for the academy, but there it is. A realm sufficiently apart from our everyday concerns as to be mentioned only with a certain hesitation. Okay, we're a little frightened of something that's truly beautiful because it represents something to us that we recognize is maybe beyond normal human capability, demands something of us that we might not be capable of reaching. The judgment of beauty is not merely a statement of preference. It demands a Kantian act of attention. This beauty is independent of any use to which it might be put. It's not utilitarian. The work of art is a thing whose value resides in it and not in its purpose. Now for music it's great because music doesn't do a whole lot. The decorative arts, that's different. Right? There's a great cabinet, a piece of art. There's a great table, a piece of art. We can get to that if we'd like. Also, here's the real contentious issue, but I've got to say it anyway. Aesthetic judgment concerns what you ought and ought not to like. The ought here has a moral weight music and morality? Come on. Most people would laugh at that, right? But let's think about that. Let's think about that. We'll come back to it. Dutton wrote a book called The Art Instinct. In it he asks, okay, so beauty is exemplified in art, among other things. And there's obviously natural beauty, but man-made beauty is often in some sort of form of art. He says that in all cultures, there are simply two categories that art appears in. That's it. One is artifacts, a painting, right, that we have from 1,000 years ago. Maybe a sculpture that somehow managed to survive. In the musical realm, a score. The document that somehow that tells us what a composer envisioned from a musical standpoint. And the other category, other than artifacts, would be performers. Any idea we have any performers in the room? A few? What do? You play, you perform, right? There it is. It's as simple as that. So it's an artifact or a performance. So what can we say about these artifacts and these performances that are universal? Okay, one, guess what? We get pleasure from it, don't we? You don't usually go to a concert and say, oh, God, I'm going to hate this. What the hell am I doing here? You go because you expect to find it pleasurable, right? If you look at a piece of art, hopefully you will get pleasure from that. Okay, so it's pleasure. And by the way, it's pleasure not that you expect to get anything from, except for students if you're getting credit for going to the performance, right? But it's something that you do for its own sake, actually. You're not going to get rich from it. It's not going to help you in your mating cycle, although it might. Right? But that's not why you go to it. Okay. All art requires skill and virtuosity. Of some sort. That's part of everything in every culture that we consider art. Skill and virtuosity. That's why we have a school of music, so that we can learn the skills to become virtuosic. Style. Here's an interesting one. I had to think about this one. Style. Every object and performance in all art forms are made in recognizable style. Was that music you just heard in a particular style? If it had any effect on you, it had to have been. Why? It had to have been written according to some kind of rules of form, composition, or expression. Right? It has to be. Style provides a stable, predictable, normal background against which artists may create elements of novelty and expressive surprise. The only way I can tell a joke that makes fun of something that you expect is if you know what to expect. And then I somehow don't deliver. I go around it, to the side of it. Right? The only way you can have the surprise symphony of Haydn is, in this case, if you have a thunderstroke in the timpani, in what is prior a purely pervasive piano atmosphere. So that while somebody's just starting to nod off up in the box, right, or sip a drink, right, because it's outside of the stylistic framework that Haydn had set up and that listeners expected. Okay, that's creativity and novelty. No, I didn't do that. It was style. Novelty and creativity. Creativity and novelty are a locus of individuality or genius in art, referring to that aspect of art that is not governed by the rules or routines. Can you have it both ways? Sure you can. In musical terms, or in Stravinskyan terms, Stravinsky said, look, every piece I write has to have a fence around it. Most of what I do resides in that area inside the fence. But damn it, I'm the composer, and if I want to hop onto the fence or hop over the fence, I'm in charge. I can do that. But we have to have this terrain here that sets up the contours for the piece. Precisely so for that moment of genius or surprise can be expressed in the context of the art form that you're witnessing. Okay, criticism. Whenever artistic forms are found, they exist alongside some kind of critical language of judgment and appreciation, simple or elaborate. It really means that, guess what? The only way we really know what we think, and think about this, because in the Hebrew Bible, God called the world into being with words. How do we know what we think? What's the only way we know what we really think? Is by speaking about something, or then speaking in a written form, writing something down and saying, here's what I think about this. Here's what's going on. So of course we want to talk about it, right? And that means some sort of critical language that's able to help us decide what's worthy of our time. Okay, special focus. What do we call that thing around a painting? Anybody want to tell me? A frame. It's a word that tells us exactly what we're doing. We're framing off the space of the painting and saying, guess what? This separates the painting from the rest of the world. You're just going to focus on this part, right? Beethoven's First Symphony. You've got a nice introduction, which is essentially a framing device. It says, here's the start, get ready, get ready, get ready. And now, here we go. We're off. A framing device in music. Okay. So works of art and artistic performances tend to be bracketed off from ordinary life, made a separate and dramatic focus of experience. We make it special. It's in the nature of art to demand particular attention. Right? I mean, I'm flattered that you're all here, because guess what? You're giving me your attention. You've decided you're going to come and you're actually going to listen to this. Right? You've decided this is a special, it's not an artistic experience, but you're stepping outside of your normal activities. Expressive individuality. The potential to express individual personality is generally latent in art practices, whether or not it is fully achieved. It's either Scruton or Murray talks about this. When we talk about science, what do we tend to talk about? We tend to talk about a discovery of an idea. The person who discovers the idea, it's really not so important, is it? It doesn't matter if it's Einstein who discovered relativity, or if it was Bohr who discovered relativity, or somebody else who was 3 months earlier but didn't get it in the journal. It's the idea that we're concerned with. But we can't have Beethoven's Ninth Symphony without Beethoven, the person, the human, the individual, telling us something about his understanding of the musical world in that piece. Okay? We can't separate the two. Emotional saturation. The experience of works of art is shot through with emotion. There are two kinds. The kind provoked or incited by the represented content of art, visual, right? You see Guernica by Picasso and you realize that, yes, he's somehow trying to express to you the horrifying nature of war in the 20th century. Is it a beautiful piece? It's a beautiful piece in its truthfulness. Very different than Leonardo's Last Supper, that represents balance, decorum, shows us about perspective. The kind in which emotions are encountered in the art, works of art can be pervaded by a distinct emotional flavor or tone. That perhaps more applies to music. What was the tone, or what is the tone that I was trying to get at in the music you first heard? The music, the first movement of Black Light. I know what I was trying to do. Does it matter if you know what I was trying to do? Do you think that you understood it the exact same way I did? We'll find out. The works have an emotional contour, an emotional perspective, and in fact, an emotional landscape. Okay? Music works on many different levels. It unites the entire individual who listens, who creates. It's about the body, it's about the mind, and it's about the emotions. In a way that, well, we'll come to that. There's an intellectual challenge too, isn't there? What's the intellectual challenge? Works of art tend to be designed to utilize the combined variety of human perceptual and intellectual capacities to the full extent. Indeed, the best works stretch them beyond ordinary limits. Oh. In other words, that artist is asking you to do something that you've never done before, because he or she never did it before either, by the way. The full exercise of mental capacities is in itself a source of aesthetic pleasure. We love thinking. We love playing. We love putting this stuff together and playing in imaginative ways with the world in which we find ourselves. That's one of the key things that makes us different from other species. I'll argue with the animal activists later, but just go with me on that for at least now, if that's a problem. Artistic traditions and institutions. Art objects and performances are created, and to a degree, given significance by their place in the history and traditions of their art. That's why musicians can be such a bore. Excuse me, musicians. Why is that? Because we get together and we say, man, did you hear that performance 2 weeks ago by Yo-Yo? Oh, no, you missed it? Oh, you missed it. You should have heard the way he played that last passage, right? Because for us, this isn't a tradition. Yeah, but when Pablo Casals did it, you know the recording from 1933? You don't know it? Oh, you better go listen to that recording because you got to listen to it. Oh, you haven't heard this Bach cantata? Well, of course you can't understand Steve Reich's Tehillim unless you know this cantata of Bach, because it's clear that Reich knew that piece. Now, does it mean that you're not going to be able to enjoy the piece? Of course you are. But what this is suggesting is that, yes, we've fallen with the tradition of people who have been at this for a very long time. And it behooves us, perhaps, to even know a little bit about their work, rather than to cut ourselves off from that tradition. Okay. High art traditions demand individuality. The importance of individuality, of emotional saturation in art, is what counts. How emotions are revealed in the art through technique, structure, balance, and the blending of sounds. Works of music are not beautiful because they arouse emotions in us, as a drug might. They are beautiful because of how the emotions are created by the total structure of the music itself. The greatest works of art are also emotionally distinct, right? I mean, it's old hat, but Beethoven 5, right? Is fate knocking at the door? I don't know what the hell that means, quite frankly. I know what they're driving at. I know whoever came up with it, what his idea was. I know the emotional content that he's trying to portray. And okay, if that's what he hears, fine. But we know there's something very deep and rich emotionally going on in that piece and other pieces that affect us deeply. The central characteristics that adhere in the very greatest works of art, the greatest works of art, by making judgments, somebody's making judgments, by the way, complexity. Their elements are meaningfully interrelated within a whole work. Complexity doesn't mean sheer complicatedness, by the way, but rather the presence of densely significant interrelationships. Artistic masterpieces fuse myriad disparate elements, layer upon layer of meaning, into a single unified, self-enhancing whole. Right? Schoenberg used to say he wants to write a piece, you know, where you look at it like this, and you can turn it and look at it like this, and you can see it from the top, and then you see it from the bottom, and you understand the interrelationship of all of these parts. It's whole in and of itself. It doesn't matter what you see or don't hear. It is all there. Now we're assuming that it's a great piece, by the way. They seem, and here's the words of Dutton, who is generally a non-believer, by the way. They seem like miracles. Oops. That's a funny word for somebody who doesn't think there's something the possibility of transcendence. Above even the highest levels of chess, mathematics, or science itself. Science itself. The greatest works of art unite every aspect of human experience. Intellect and the will, but also emotions and human values of every kind, including ugliness and evil. I just heard The Damnation of Faust by Berlioz a few days ago. The finest works of art draw us into them in order to yield them deep, intricate, imaginative experiences. They are marked by the utmost lucidity and coherence. And now here we get to something truly important. There is an authenticity of artistic purpose. A sense that the artist, damn it, means it, right? Whatever it is. Now, just because an artist, by the way, thinks what he's written is the greatest thing since sliced bread, doesn't mean it is. But it means that anything that is great has to have this authentic nature of artistic purpose. And authenticity is a truth of personal expression. Why would I want to pull the wool over your eyes, in other words? An artist has to be speaking directly from his soul to your soul, from his heart to your heart, from his brain to your brain, from his emotional understanding of what it means to be human to your understanding of what it means to be human. It has to provide meaning for the artist, or why would he waste his time doing this thing meant to give pleasure? Unless the goal is to also give pleasure to others. In other words, it is a transactional experience. Cage famously said, what does writing music, playing music, and listening music have to do with each other? And the answer is, John, what a stupid statement. Sorry, doesn't make any sense. The answer is very simple. Guess what? The artist does wish to communicate something in his humanity to the listener. That comes through the artist, through the performer, who is transmitting that understanding, that humanity across, again, the ether that separates us or that connects us. Okay. With that, we're going to play Black Light just a little bit louder this time. And just the first movement yet again. So I'd like you to think about, okay, does this music strike me as authentic? It's not that I want you to say, okay, is you like your visual? Say, okay, is there something straightforward happening here? What's the architecture of this piece? What's the story of this piece? How does it start? Now remember, how does it start? Does it start loud or soft, high or low? That's it. Is there a tune anywhere in our future? Oh, there is. Does it come back again? Yes, it does. Does it come back the same or different? Music is one of the few art forms where you can repeat something many times without the listener, by the way, getting bored. How much can you repeat without the listener getting bored, or without detracting from the onward movement of the piece? Is there a climax in the piece? Where does it appear in the architecture of the piece? What happens after that in terms of the fading of the sound? After that climax, what are you left with in terms of registral space, in terms of volume? Then what happens thereafter? Is there a return of materials that you've heard before? Do phrases always end, or do they end sometimes in mid-sentence? Do they end with a question mark? And then are they finally concluded? Just as I'm talking to you, and some sentences demand a continuation and some others don't. Music pertains to that in some respects also. And then finally, how does this piece end? Does it end? Is it a full end? Is it a full stop? Has the boat come to the dock and the ropes have been thrown on so it's held close? Or has it come to the dock but there's a hint that it might take off again? Is it that plane practicing landing at the base almost touches down and says, fooling you, and up it goes again? Here's an artistic analogy. Here, we're going to listen to Black Light one more time. Please close your eyes. Go with me on that. Try it one more time. Think about some of those issues. Okay, we'll leave some of those questions dangling again for you to ponder subconsciously. Now let me, with that as background, talk a little bit about Western music in the university. So we need to talk a little bit about classical music, because that's mostly what I will be talking about, in the wider culture, particularly since the big cultural hit it took in the late 60s. In the 70s and 80s, serious reviews and articles in classical music was still to be found in most of the mass market magazines such as Time and Newsweek. Now the irregular article only appears in the New Yorker, not exactly a mass market rag. Reviewers in regional newspapers have mostly been gotten rid of, or their beat has been given over to someone completely without training in music, such as the Restaurant or Country Music Review. The intellectual journals that should deal in this area have of late fallen down on the task as well. Commentary, which is a long and rich history of music reviewers, most recently under the formidable Terry Teachout, has retreated to a general category of culture, whether high, mid, or lowbrow, not being particularly clear, with film, for example, apparently being treated now on the same level as classical music, as is Broadway, song, pop, and jazz. Please, no gasps, I'll explain as we get along here. The new criteria, with the fine ear and pen of Jay Nordlinger, reviews concerts in New York City, albeit mostly programs of older music. An occasional review by him will also appear in the National Review. The result is that classical music, and particularly new classical music, has been marginalized, if not excised from the larger cultural landscape. I, of course, left out the paper of record, the New York Times. It does indeed continue to review concerts of classical and new classical music. Having said this, it also reviews the latest pop, indie, country, western, and rap concerts as well. Thus, its actual reportage of serious music is drastically reduced from only 25 years ago. This began under the guidance of John Rockwell, whose prevailing doctrine was that music of all styles is essentially equal and should be treated as such. High and low no longer exist as useful categories. Now, being a child of the 60s, I have to admit I love the Beatles, Miles Davis, and pop and other jazz greats. But, a big but, to compare their output, both in terms of quantity, quality, and emotional breadth, to the greats of the classical music tradition, Bach, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Copland, and Stravinsky, to name just a few, is simply not realistic or intellectually honest. It's also true that to enjoy classical music requires a modicum of literacy, and as in any area of intellectual endeavor, the more the better. Classical music is, after all, about ideas expressed in sound. It used to be that the professional class of the previous generations knew this music through the playing of an instrument, with musical training through their schooling, from grade school through college, and from the regular attendance and the gained familiarity of the music thereby at concerts and plays. This now is essentially lost. These intellectually vibrant activities have largely been overtaken by sports and film. The former is, while fun, trivial at best, while the latter, primarily because it's being team-based in its production, not to mention driven by mass market considerations and being formula-driven, has been reduced to entertainment for kids or for adults who still wish to be kids. Again, lots of this is fun, but very rarely, I'm allowing for exceptions, don't get me wrong, but very rarely art. To take a review from the late 80s, but that applies to the present, one need only take a report from the ground, as it were, with the section on music in Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. When reading his comments at the time of the publication of the book, I thought he overstated the case. After a more recent rereading, and my experiences up to the current time in academia, I fear now his comments are a radical understatement. He suggests that music is now indeed central to the culture of university students. But it's rock music, not classical, which occupies this position. Classical music is now a special taste, and no classical music has been produced that really speaks to this generation. He refers to Plato, for whom music is the medium of the human soul in its most ecstatic condition of wonder and terror. Music always involves a balance between passion and reason. Bloom suggests the history of music as a series of attempts to give form and beauty to the dark, chaotic, premonitory forces in the soul, to make them serve a higher purpose. He, of course, does not find this with rock music, where he suggests the themes are sex, hate, and a smarmy, hypocritical version of brotherly love. Just think, I want to hold your hand. In this, he talks about what he knows best, the lyrics. But his major concern is rock music's effect on education, where he believes it ruins the imagination of young people and makes it very difficult for them to have a passionate relationship to the art and thought that are the substance of liberal education. Is the academy still a place for liberal education? Is Texas Tech? And finally, rock music encourages passion and provides models that have no relation to any life the young people who go to universities can possibly lead, or to the kinds of admiration encouraged by liberal studies. Without the cooperation of the sentiments, anything other than technical education is a dead letter. I believe that this has become even more descriptive of our current situation. Dr. Balch and I were talking over a meal, and the question is, are we optimistic or pessimistic? So in this aspect, I have a certain bit of pessimism, but I remain optimistic in the long run. We'll talk about that. To understand why this is so from a musical standpoint, let us now move to the issue of the different natures of classical, serious, or concert music, as opposed to pop, jazz, or other non-Western musics. What is it that differentiates these musics, and why should one be more, to use academic jargon, privileged than another? Well, one should first begin with the question of history. I know history is not exactly a central topic anymore in education, but let's at least start with history in this manner. The history of Western music is initiated with the ancient Hebrews, Christians, and Greeks. Thus, the history of Western music goes back at least a few thousand years. But its history as an art, or as an endeavor seeking transcendence, and in a sophisticated written musical system, goes back about 1,500 years or so in the West. Thus, we're able to track our historical understanding of sound back a very long time, from monody, or single lines, to organum, a bunch of lines generally moving in parallel, and then through a trajectory of counterpoint and harmony that has no other comparison in the world's music. Okay, you might want to decide if that's a true statement or not. Okay, Charles Murray, in his book on human achievement, talks about meta ideas that have actually changed the way we understand the world. He says, guess what, folks? Counterpoint and harmony. That revolutionized understanding of music. It might also pertain to the issue of why is it that Western music has overtaken the world, whether it's in its simplest form, as popular music, or in its more, quote, elite form, as in the history of Western art music. Nor can we add to tremendously to the arsenal of Western music through the study of and incorporation of aspects of other musics, which Western composers have indeed done, as in other spheres of inquiry, but the resultant music of the West remains singular in many respects. We dismiss its tremendous depth and rigor at our peril, even in the music of present luminaries, such as Steve Reich or Philip Glass, who are known for their incorporation of aspects of music of Africa and India, respectively. Their use of harmony and counterpoint is a purely Western phenomenon, and their music could not exist outside of a Western context. Pop music, from a purely musical standpoint, purely musical standpoint, is too simplistic to be given much consideration for our intellectual attention. It panders in the most banal of ideas. Where Western classical music gives us sophistication of architecture, pop gives us the 3-minute song, and/or endless and mindless repetition, and thus an inability to advance any kind of sophisticated scenario or argument. Like film, pop relies on formula and production values. Its history is just 60 years old, perhaps a little longer if you add certain historical antecedents, like Buddy Holly, whose museum I went to today. Go Buddy. But finally, its emotional depth, both in music and word, as mentioned by Bloom, is rarely above the infantile. However, it is clearly persuasive and ubiquitous in its societal presence. It continues to dominate the scene and the psyche of our students. Jazz goes back a bit further, the latter part of the 19th century, but it travels to the realm of relatively simple forms, as in the typical statement of the head, which is the tune, followed by improvisation amongst the members of the ensemble, and then a restatement of the tune. Thus, its architectural range is limited. Its emotional range, while certainly more than that of pop, doesn't come close to the breadth and depth of music of the classical world. World musics began their serious introduction into the West in the latter part of the 19th century, through the budding field of anthropology, which then grew into the separate field of ethnomusicology. In the middle of the 20th century, this included primarily the study of high art musics of different cultures, like those of Indonesia, India, and perhaps the court music of Japan being the primary interest of investigation. These musics have the admirable quality of age, tradition, sophistication of form, and theoretical and intellectual depth. At the same time, they have been relatively static through their histories, certainly in comparison with Western art music. They also are quite obviously not ours, and thus don't speak to our broadest experience. Ethnomusicology has since branched out to folk and popular music of all sorts. These music's power or importance as art is very much less important than its cultural influence and place. So given this cultural backdrop, now let's get right to the heart of this. What can we say about music in the academy, in a place I suspect like Tech, although I don't know. You'll have to tell me. In this regard, the academy is defined as institutions of higher learning, such as state universities, private universities, and the like. I'm not going to talk about Juilliard, Curtis, in other words, professional hot tanks, if you will, or hot, what am I looking for? Hot houses for performance in particular. The music major, one who is studying instrument music, musicology, or composition, is of course quite another story from the English, math, or history major. So these different sub-populations will be looked at both for the differences and commonalities. What do all students share in their experience of music and that of Western classical music? First and foremost must be the pervasiveness of the popular music around them. Like almost all of us at this time, students can't exist in any environment without encountering it. It's piped into our stores, into our malls, into our restaurants, into our coffee houses, into the doctor's offices, and dare I say, I bet right into the student union here. Right? It certainly is in ours. Students listen to it in their iPods and in their cars at all hours of the day. There's hardly a moment when we are not hearing some form of music. Whereas in previous generations, students and everybody moved from relatively quiet times into a musical sphere, now they are inhabited or surrounded by music of some sort most of their waking moments. Whereas in previous generations, they had to seek out music by performing an instrument or going to a concert, now one has to actively seek and occasionally demand silence. You gotta go into a restaurant and say, can you put me in a corner where I'm not gonna hear the music quite so loud, or can you turn it down? The result is that the ability to actually register and engage in musical ideas has been reduced. Okay, when I asked you to focus, I did that because we're not used to that kind of focusing of our attention. Students of any sort must be taught how to truly listen. Since they're also distracted, they must also be taught how to concentrate and to do so over spans of time which they are unfamiliar. And don't worry, I'm close to the end. Since they have dealt mostly with pop songs of a short duration, anything much longer tends to create confusion, a sense of the uncomfortable, and then eventually outright fatigue. Right? Think of your friends who are coming to hear you play a Bach cello suite. We also encounter that Bloomian problem of real emotional and spiritual engagement. This generation hardly knows how to think, but it certainly doesn't know how to feel. That may sound counterintuitive, but I think it's true. There is a stark disengagement of the emotional from the intellectual, and our students have trouble engaging their senses, their feelings, and their intellect in a unified manner. In other words, putting it all together. They literally don't know how or what to feel, and have trouble telling the real from the fraudulent. Music majors will know some of the music of their own instrument. They will rarely have encountered much other musical literature. They will know the names of some of the major composers of the past, but rarely any of the last 50 years or so. It's highly unlikely that non-music majors will have ever heard a Bach partita, Beethoven symphony, or work by Stravinsky. If asked to name a living composer, or even one from the last 100 years, they will most likely mention, who do you think? Anybody have any ideas? John Williams. Not Copland, Ives, or Adams. They'll say, oh yeah, John Williams, man, I love that Superman tune. That's the relationship to, quote, classical music. In their acquaintance with towering film or film music, they have a commonality with many budding composition students who also come with an interest in film music and a desire to have a career in this area, and know little of the classical musical tradition. The distinction of music written for the business sphere as opposed to art music is not really something they fathom. John Williams is a talented man, don't get me wrong, but his primary skills lie in writing music quickly, that is a good pastiche of other composers' styles, is catchy and emotionally appropriate for the image it accompanies. It lacks the one and most important quality that we talked about in the Dutton brought to our attention. What is that? A singular voice of moment and urgency with something important to say. He's good at everything except that. This generation has real trouble differentiating the real from the market image. This is true in performance as well. While their technical level may be superb, their ability to convey affect, feeling, is problematic. This is all to say their general level of ignorance is rather deep. The situation may be slightly different at top universities as opposed to public ones, but the pervasive cultural stew makes for a greater similarity than difference. The music majors will correct this situation through the taking of the usual historical and theoretical courses. They will do this in a rather desultory manner. You performers, bad boys and girls, as they're not usually really interested in becoming deeper musicians per se, as much as they are in the betterment of their technical capabilities on their instrument of choice. They wish to become adept specialists, which is something the university and their teachers encourage. The active engagement and expansion of the mind is less sought after than the athletic aspects of musical virtuosity. That most of these students will never be a virtuoso status or professionally employed is rarely spoken of, as it is too much of a threat to the prevailing system, involving a real introspection that could prove dangerous for us all. The non-music major is presented with a cornucopia of possibilities. Along with the traditional music appreciation offerings, courses in the history of rock and roll and the history of jazz are ubiquitous and well subscribed. Ensemble experience have expanded from choirs, jazz ensembles, bands, and orchestras to include steel band and a number of world music experiences, including mariachi, Ghanese drumming, gamelan, etc. All of these options are presented in a value-free framework, of course. Thus, it's not quite possible, in fact, more than likely, that the typical non-music major will never experience the legacy of Western music in his academic career, let alone be given some expertise to aid in absorbing its complexities and transcendent mysteries. So what of the general university environment for music? Well, music faculty pretty much go about our business, but there's a sense of ennui in the air. They are talented and competent, and most love what they do. But they know that what they teach matters as little to the general university culture as it does to the larger culture. Whereas in the past one could find a decent minority of general faculty, administrators, and even a president or two who knew and enjoyed parts of the classical repertoire. This hardly exists now. These parties might know and appreciate a little jazz, love, classic rock, but experience of Western classical music in no way engages them. Certainly what the music faculty and their students offer is no longer considered of high value. They feel and are somewhat marginalized. A few may try to be hip to get with it, but it's a hollow game. Concerts need to be scheduled around basketball and football games. Does that ring a bell? It's certainly true of my institution. Coaches are paid millions, athletes coddled, and on the academic side, scientists bring in the big money through private and public research grants. The schools of business and law, public health and medicine are endowed by their successful graduates and major community philanthropists. The arts and humanities, which only provide the reasons for an attempt to talk about why it's worth being alive, are the poor stepchildren who take the back seat or bench to all of them. The music community understands its perceived value, which is slight, and knows that there is not much it can do right now to change this perception or evaluation. Simply put, it generally has little educational, financial, or communal clout. So all schools of music are putting up the good fight for the tradition of Western classical music. They are beset by forces within their own sphere, and the culture within the university and the general culture that makes this increasingly more difficult to sustain. Having said that, I'm not stopping writing music. Having said that, performers are not stopping performing. Why? Because we have to do what we do. Because we love what we do. Because we know no matter what happens, sooner or later, there will be people who will recognize what it is we are doing and trying to do, and understand this basic human phenomenon of reaching for beauty rather than surface titillation. There you have it. I'll be happy to entertain some comments. I probably went a little longer than expected. I apologize for that if I did, if I kept anybody. I'm not playing Black Light again. You'll have to go listen to that. You can get it on YouTube or go buy it. I do have CDs if anybody would like to purchase a CD and continue your adventure more with some of my music. Any questions?
Well, first of all,